In this episode, the featured film returns the viewer to perhaps Hollywood's favorite genre, adapts their story from an already famous, perhaps timeless classic from Japan, and showcases a cast that is so good, so balanced, so full of current and future stars that I think this film comes as close to perfection as any Hollywood film that has ever been made. These stories and more from the 22nd row. The Magnificent Seven was released in 1960. This is, of course, the genre of the glorious Western, in this case also an action film. The setting is the border between the southern US and Mexico for a bit, and then primarily a small village in Mexico. And of course, it is a period piece, given that it is a Western. Well, as I've said more than a few times in this series, the Western genre is such a terrific genre for storytelling, and there's no surprise as to why that is. Good guys, bad guys, sometimes very simple stories, sometimes very complicated stories. Lots of action, gunplay, heroes, tragic themes, happy themes, uplifting themes, or just fun, pure action and fun. And all of the Westerns I've focused on in this series have bits and pieces of each of these elements, but they're all different in their own way. So I've looked at these films before, leading up to The Magnificent Seven. The Searchers, starring John Wayne, a psychological Western, a Western that has its share of action, certainly has its good guys and bad guys, but has very tough adult themes, and is perhaps as good a film as director John Ford and actor John Wayne ever made. Just a spectacularly watchable and entertaining movie. Next up would be The Wild Bunch, made in 1969, released in 1969, a film about tired, older outlaws who see the future and it looks bleak, and so they're trying to get one last score to make their money and retire, if that is indeed possible for gunslingers and gangsters and outlaws to retire. A very stylized film by Sam Peckinpah, a terrifically watchable film with many, many iconic moments. Then there is Once Upon a Time in the West, a film made by Italian director Sergio Leone, a masterpiece in my opinion, given he made about 4 terrific Western films, of which most moviegoers know: A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But my favorite remains Once Upon a Time in the West, just because it's a far-reaching story. It once again has terrific characters, well-defined, great actors and actresses, and it has something I like a lot in Westerns and in action films, a female lead who is just spectacular, as in Claudia Cardinale. And then in the fourth film that we've discussed in this series is The Professionals, a film about a kidnapping, about a rich U.S. landowner wanting to get his wife back, and hires professionals, 4 men who have different sets of skills, to come together, pay them a lot of money, go into Mexico, into very dangerous territory, find his wife, and bring her back. Sort of the quest film. In some ways, The Professionals harkens back to the Magnificent Seven, because The Magnificent Seven is definitely a professionals film. Get together a bunch of people who have very well-defined skills, who are very good at what they do, and solve a problem. And that is what this particular Western is all about. It's based on a Japanese film, but The Magnificent Seven has every element of a good Western. Of course, the scenery. Almost all Westerns are outdoor shoots most of the time. They have barren landscapes. They have beautiful, if that word can be used, desert landscapes. Places like Monument Valley, places like the harsh terrain of northern Mexico that might also be a desert or arid. They have horses and horses and horses. They have good guys and bad guys, and lots of gunplay. They have the kind of heroes that are fun for moviegoers to see, because of course, do we really see them anymore these days? So to have a period piece of a Western that's taking place sometime in the mid to late 19th century, with tough guys, tough women, survivors who in many cases live by the gun, but they always live by their wits. That's the Western movie. That's the genre. That's why I think it works so well. That's why hundreds and hundreds of films were made between, I don't know, more than before 1940, between the 30s, from the beginning of talking pictures, and of course there were many Westerns made during the silent era, but certainly from the beginning of talking pictures right up to the present day, Westerns are still being made because they're just such good fodder for great storytelling. And the films I've focused on so far in this series, and I'll probably focus on some more Westerns, are just incredibly watchable, as enjoyable today on the big screen as they were when they were released, and The Magnificent Seven is no exception to that. Every Hollywood movie, every movie has source material. It could be original material, in other words, written for the screen, but it could also be from a novel, from a play, from Shakespeare, or from another movie. A foreign movie might take from a Hollywood movie, or a Hollywood movie might adapt from a foreign film. In the case of The Magnificent Seven, it is absolutely an adaptation from a foreign film released 6 years earlier. In 1954, Japanese director Akira Kurosawa released a film called The Seven Samurai. Now this is a very long film, 3.5 hours long, but it is, well, I can only say it's a brilliant film. It is very different watching Japanese films or watching any foreign film than watching films maybe in your home country, be it North America or the UK. They all have their own unique way of storytelling, I find, such as the Italian Westerns or other films from Europe. The Seven Samurai was a very successful film. I don't know if it was incredibly successful right from the get-go in 1954, but it's one of those films where Hollywood directors would see it and say, boy, I wish I'd made this kind of film. This guy is incredible. And in fact, director Akira Kurosawa has a resume that is pretty incredible. And I urge keen moviegoers, movie fans, to look up Kurosawa and look for his films. He made a half a dozen spectacular films and made films for decades and is clearly a movie legend. Not a Hollywood legend, of course, because he worked out of Japan, but a movie legend. And so the powers that be for The Magnificent Seven liked this film so much that they wanted to do an adaptation. Now, adaptations, of course, can be very, very similar to the originals, where they can take what they think are the best elements or maybe the most entertaining elements from an original and modify them for a North American audience, or more importantly, for a North American location. If a Japanese film like The Seven Samurai takes place somewhere in Japan, and you want to tell the story with very similar themes or identical themes, but translate that story to the Midwest, because we're doing a Western, northern Mexico, or anywhere in the West, either the US or Mexico, then you've got to make changes to make the story work in those locales. And I think the changes that were made for The Magnificent Seven were extremely effective, worked brilliantly, and made for an incredibly fun picture. There's plenty of gunplay, very little blood shown. This was 1960 after all, but plenty of gunplay, plenty of action, plenty of horses, lots of good guys and lots of bad guys. And so they took all of the key elements from The Seven Samurai and 6 years later released The Magnificent Seven. And all I can say is, well done. I think it's clear that the powers that be behind The Magnificent Seven wanted to say, we love The Seven Samurai. We want to make a movie hopefully as successful, as good, as entertaining as that one in our own way, and with the changes we've had to make for it to take place as a Western in North America. And in fact, when I looked it up, the Akira Kurosawa, the director of The Seven Samurai, said that he loved The Magnificent Seven and was involved in a remake of that, I think, many, many, many years later. But anyways, the community of Westerns, the worldwide community of Westerns, is a relatively small community, especially when they make films of this caliber. And so it's no surprise that the powers that be behind the Magnificent Seven love the Seven Samurai, and the powers that be behind the Seven Samurai love the Magnificent Seven. Adaptation clearly at its best. And as any moviegoer can tell you, that adaptations are not always successful. You find a terrific film, perhaps a foreign film that wants to be made by Hollywood, or a Hollywood film that a foreign entity wants to remake in their own way and with their own style. It doesn't always work. There's lots of reasons why it's hard to do and can fail or just not come up to the level of the film they are adapting. But in the case of this Magnificent Seven, there was no problem whatsoever. So what is our story that we're going to watch for the next 2 hours? It's a fun story. It's a perfectly designed story. However Kurosawa came up with it for the Seven Samurai, who knows? But it's simply a case of victims being victims and bad guys, and the victims reaching out to someone to help them against the bad guys. So in our story, we have some outlaws, banditos, Mexican bandits, who of course have a charismatic leader, and that leader has to feed his men and has to pay his men. Otherwise, they will go to the highest bidder or someone who provides better. And so what they do is they go around to small villages in the area in which they are active, and they just take what they want. Food, any kind of valuables, if there are any. And for the most part, there aren't many valuables in these villages. But certainly food, sometimes men, sometimes women. But the main thing is the food, so that they can continue to do their things, robbing trains or payrolls, etc., etc., etc. And so the farmers, who are typical of all these villages, they're farmers. They grow things, which is why the outlaws can go in and take the corn, take whatever they can take to keep feeding themselves. They get tired of this, and they realize that there's an end game here, that they will end up starving to death, because sooner or later the bandits are going to take everything and then move on to another village that they can force to do what they want to. So they have an elder in the village, and this elder is a wise man of sorts, and he says, you got to fight. And they say, well, we don't know how to fight. We're a bunch of stupid farmers. And he says, go to the border. They're obviously not too far from the U.S. border. There's lots of guns up there. There's people who know how to use them. Go up there and ask them where to buy the guns. Get as much money together as you can. Go north and buy some guns. And so a group of 3 representatives of this village, they go north. They go into, I guess, the closest town over the border to find someone who can sell them guns. So our first scene, where the bad guys in the village, we see how they take and take and take, and they're very nasty fellows. So we learn about the head of this group. His name is Calvera. He's the head outlaw, charismatic. He's clearly, obviously, the leader, and he knows what he wants, and he knows how to get what he wants, and we know that they are the bad guys. We see the farmers, and then in the very next scene, 3 of the farmers are up into this town, and they are looking to buy some guns. But there's something happening when they get there. And it's just, I think, brilliant storytelling that they have this terrific scene of something very trivial. They got to bury a guy who died. And the hearse has got to ride up the hill to Boot Hill. I wonder if it's the Boot Hill, a very famous burial place in U.S. Western lore. And there's a problem. And it's a very contemporary problem, in fact, and I find it amazing that in 1960, if it's referencing, 100 years earlier or so, that this problem is very topical. And there's lots of people in the town. I mean, when I say lots, it's a small town as well, so there's not tens of thousands, there's hundreds. And there's a couple of drifters in the town, and one of them says, look, let me help you. He'll drive the hearse up the hill. It's a horse-drawn hearse. Another fellow who sees this realizes he probably needs some help, so he jumps on the hearse too. And so we see immediately, we don't know it at the time, but immediately we see our 2 main heroes, our 2 main stars out of many stars. These are our 2 main stars. And there's an event that takes place that showcases their talents, showcases their courage, showcases the kind of world in which they live, and also provides the storytellers with an action sequence right at the beginning of the film. And it's, of course, terrific. It's fun. There's an element of comedy to it, as well as clever dialogue, snappy dialogue, and a happy resolution. And of course, the farmers see this and they say, that's the guy we got to talk to, the main guy who drove the hearse. And so they track him down and they say, can you please help us buy some guns? We don't have a lot of money, but we got to buy some guns because our village is being victimized by these outlaws, and we've decided we're going to fight them to the death. And our main hero, and his name is Chris, nothing more than just Chris, he says, well, guns aren't that cheap anymore, even though there's a lot of them. So why don't you hire gunmen to do the job? Hire gunmen to go back to your village and pick a fight with these outlaws. You could, all the village men, he says, are all your villagers are onto this, are with you on this? And they say, yes, everybody's with us. Then I say, okay, well, then you get just a finite number of guys, not too many, half dozen or so, and go back to the village, and between you and the half dozen professional gunmen, let's see what happens. And so there's our setup right away, very quickly. They have a setup and they say, well, okay, well, we don't know anything about gunmen. We don't know. Everybody in this town, every American we've seen carries a gun. And our hero says, yeah, of course, but that doesn't mean they're good with it. And so the next few scenes shows what it means to be good with a gun and the kind of men that our hero Chris is going to be looking for them, to offer them a very simple gig, a very low-paying gig, to go back to Mexico and defend these villagers. And so one by one, we see the 7 start to form. They're all different, which is really important for ensemble storytelling. The audience has to recognize who everybody is and not get confused. Is that this guy or is that that guy? So they're all have little vignettes about who they are. They're all unique characters. We see them one after the other, and in this very early part of the film, we're set with 6 characters, including Chris, who said he didn't really want to go, but we'll see if and when he changes his mind and why he does. So they get 6 members to go back to the village, but there's another wannabe who is a Mexican who was also up in this U.S. town, but he's young and proud, and Chris has something to say about young and proud men. But he's going to be in some ways a comedic foil, but also the energy of the film, what a young person is like. How does a gunslinger start out? All of the 6 of the 7 we see are veterans. They're not young men, they're not old men, but they're pros. They've been doing this for a long time, it's obvious. And so we also get an added character who is youth, and say, well, probably isn't this how these guys must have started? Very young, 20 years old, 21, 22, ready to fight anybody and anything and anywhere. And so we have a tremendously prepared story for the 6 main guys and the 7th who taggles along behind him to add a little bit of comic relief and to add some fun to the story. It isn't a psychological, heavy-hitting, adult-themed story. It's a fun story, but it's got a serious premise, which is they're going to go down there and all hell's going to break loose because they're going to fight these bad guys to the death. As Chris, the boss, says, this is a fight that is to the death. There's no backing out. There's no turning back. There's no fighting for a few days and saying, that's enough, I've had it. You got to do this right to the end. And so by the time they get back down to the village, our story is set up. The paths are clear. The characters are clear. There's some tension within the group, but Chris is clearly the boss. His number 2, the guy who was also on the hearse, his name is Vin. They are the guys who have sort of brought everybody else together. They know each other. They all have different types of skills, and we're all set. We're set for the preparation. We're set for how to set up the village. We're set to show how they interact with the village and how they prepare for this battle. And that's our story. And so the rest of the story is the preparation, the initial interactions with the bad guys, the fighting, the battle between the bad guys, the twists and turns that take place. And over 2 hours, it's just a really fun ride with no wasted moments, whatever. Even the quiet moments have a purpose. There's nothing wasted. There's no side stories that threaten to derail the action or the pulse of the film. Everything is going full speed ahead, and it is just a fun ride. And the story is, I guess, as good a story as you can make for a Western film. And no surprise that the success of this story, very similar story in The Seven Samurai, meant let's use the same story and make the changes that we have to make so that it looks good in a Western in the U.S. and the north of Mexico. And so that's the story of The Magnificent Seven, and what a fun ride it's going to be. Well, as I've said before in this series, and I'll say again, casting an ensemble group of actors in a story like this is a challenge. It is so easy to make a mistake here or a mistake there, so that a film that has got a terrific story and a real potential might not quite meet the expectations of the powers that be behind these films, and say we missed it, we didn't quite hit it the way we wanted. But in the case of The Magnificent Seven, I think the best adjective to describe the result of the casting was magnificent. And it's fun to watch this film so many years later when you see a couple of established stars at the time, to be sure, but for the most part, many of the seven and more in this film went on to become megastars, and others just went on to have fantastic careers where they seem like they never stopped working for 20, 30, 40 years. And that's, again, a tribute to whoever cast this film, how they got the people who they had to get, why they chose them, to make sure they had to work together. A group of seven actors has to work together. They can't be the same seven people. They have to be unique. They have to look different. They have to talk differently. They have to have their own set of skills so that there's no repetitiveness in it. This tough guy can't be the same as that tough guy. This good-looking adventurer can't be identical to this good-looking adventurer. And so, of course, as always, when a film works as well as The Magnificent Seven does, the casting was spectacular. So in no particular order, because I think The Magnificent Seven is, of course, a terrific story, but its success, I think, is all about who are these Magnificent Seven. So let's take a look at them. Harry. Harry has probably the smallest role of the seven on screen, but he's a key character because he leads Chris to another of the gunslingers. He's the connection between them who leads to another gunslinger. So Harry is the adventurer, the big good-looking guy who loves the money, loves the gold, the diamonds, stealing the payrolls off the trains, and the women. And he is played by an actor named Brad Dexter. Now, before the smartphones came into being, I had a particularly good skill. I could remember things. I had a memory for names and faces, and having watched as many movies as I've watched, as many movie fans probably do as well, I could remember the names of actors and in movies, the names of movies. I was absolutely terrible at awards because I didn't really care too much about award ceremonies, so I wasn't able to tell you in 1964 what won Best Picture. But I tried to remember as best I could actors, actresses, directors, writers, sometimes the director of photography, sometimes producers. So whenever somebody said, "Oh, I'm a real moviegoer, I've seen everything," then I would say, let's do a test. I said, by answering this question, I'll know right away at what level of knowledge you have for the history of movies from, let's say, 1930 up to the present day. And that test was, name the seven actors of The Magnificent Seven. You could name John Wayne in Stagecoach and The Searchers. You could name Paul Newman. You could name James Garner and Cary Grant in various movies. These are all megastars, Hollywood legends. Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman. But The Magnificent Seven was famous, I think, because of those seven. So, name the Magnificent Seven. Now, many moviegoers could name 3, 4, some of the better ones 5, and some really good ones 6, but I never met anyone who could get all 7. And the 7th one that no one could remember was Brad Dexter. Now, Dexter had been a very busy actor from 1945 up until this film. He had made, just like many actors of the era, dozens and dozens of movies between 1945 and 1960. In fact, my mother was a huge fan of Brad Dexter, even though most people didn't even know who he was when they watched this film many years later, but she knew who he was because he was just a very recognizable face through all the movies of the 50s. He went on to have a career. He did television and he did other films, of course, but even in his bio, which I did look up, he says, "I'm the one that nobody can remember from The Magnificent Seven." It's unfair because Brad Dexter does a terrific job as this a lively, life-loving character who can't wait for the next adventure. He has a very small role in this, but he does the job. He's a pro's pro, and all I can say is thumbs up to number 7, Brad Dexter. Next up, an actor was introduced to Hollywood, although he had been working in Europe for a few years, probably 4 or 5 years, maybe a bit longer, very young fellow. And his name was Horst Buchholz, and he plays the young Mexican wannabe gunslinger. Now, Hollywood was famous for, if you've got an accent, we can make you Spanish, Italian, French. If it's an accent, if you speak accented English, we'll make you whatever foreigner that we need for a particular film. So Buchholz was born in Germany. Does he sound like a German in this film? I'm not sure. He has an accent, of course. It's probably not a Mexican-speaking or Spanish-speaking accent, but he's a young kid, very good-looking, and he plays Chico, the wannabe gunslinger, who tags along, and eventually we find out he might be able to do enough to be eligible to join the group, or maybe not. But he's the tag-along, and he brings youth to the cast. He brings a little bit of comedy. He is energy. He also shows us in the story, without going into details, that maybe this is how all these guys started. 20, 21 years old, ready to take on the world, completely fearless, pretty good with the gun, would get much better if they stayed alive long enough over the years, but maybe he is what they look like 10 or 15 years earlier. So Buchholz is Chico, and is very good looking in his own way, so that he's not to be confused with the other actors. And he has a fair amount of screen time. He's important to the story, and it's his first Hollywood film, and so the credits say introducing Horst Buchholz, and he does the job. Now we have a veteran gunslinger, a brooding gunslinger. Maybe he's got some mental instability. Maybe he's just been fighting the other gunslingers far too long, and his nerves are shot. We're not quite sure. He's a dandy, very well dressed all the time, has clearly lived the good life, but he's on the run, and his name is Lee, and Lee is played by Robert Vaughn. Now, we've seen Robert Vaughn before in this series, as we've seen many of the actors in this film. He was in Bullet, playing not so much a corrupt, but let's say a slimy politician in the cop show Bullet. He's an actor's actor, very good looking, but older than, for example, Horst Buchholz. Plays this guy whose nerves apparently are shot, but we're not sure. But our hero Chris says, yeah, I know, but he's a good gun, and we're going to need all the good guns we can get. And so Vaughn, I think, it just excels in this role. And as a kid, I didn't see The Magnificent Seven, of course, till much, much later. Although I am told that on television, this was the most shown movie on television for many, many, many years. Probably even more so than something like The Wizard of Oz or It's a Wonderful Life. Just everywhere you looked before streaming media took over, you could see The Magnificent Seven on television. But I remember Robert Vaughn from a fantastic TV show, and every kid like me in the early 60s loved this show. It was a spy show building off of the James Bond craze of the early 60s. It was called The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And Robert Vaughn was the lead in that show, and his name was Napoleon Solo. I mean, what a great name for a character in a movie or a TV show. And he was just, that was just such a fun show. There was so much merchandise related to that show. There were books about the Man from U.N.C.L.E. You could buy replica guns. There's some trinkets in the show. I remember all that stuff, but it was spectacularly popular, and Vaughn was the star. Now, despite that, he played a Western in The Magnificent Seven. He was in this television drama, for the most part a drama. But like other actors that I've talked about in this series, it's like he never stopped working. I think he passed away in the 20-teens, but he just made hundreds of films and television shows and just was going all the time. Just a terrific actor, a pro, again, like with all the actors in this movie, a pro's pro, and he did comedy, he did drama, he did westerns, he did cop shows, he did a little bit of everything. And Robert Vaughn plays the tortured soul to a T in The Magnificent Seven. Next we have Britt. Now Britt, again, we've seen in this series twice before. Britt is unique. He actually might be the best gun of the group and the best man with a knife in the group, which our hero Chris describes him as, which is interesting because he has a terrific vignette at the beginning of the movie that tells us what he's all about, and it really is so well put together. A nice little movie in a movie, 5 minutes long, maybe not even that long, start to finish, and we know all about Britt. Britt is played by James Coburn. Now again, we've seen James Coburn twice already in this series. We saw him in Hard Times as a co-star with another actor we'll talk about in a second, and we saw him in recently The Last of Sheila. James Coburn is one of my favorite actors because he just oozes Hollywood. He had the face, he had that voice. He just looks like a movie star as much as any actor. And I don't mean the legends, because the legends were maybe a breed apart. But Coburn, I mean, wherever you'd see him, and in all the films he did, he just looked like a movie star, and he had that movie star voice. In the case of Britt, he's quiet, reserved, but again, lethal. And the Magnificent Seven does a tremendous job of identifying this character, how different he is from the others, and he, of course, has a fair amount of screen time and does the job of making Britt come to life. And like all the other characters, we're cheering for Britt. He's quiet, he's tough, but in a softer way, because he is the expert. He is really good at everything he does. And James Coburn, as I say, is one of my favorite actors, and it was so cool to see him in at a very early part of his career, although he just turned a little bit over 30 years old, and he had been working in the 50s, but this was his breakout film, The Magnificent Seven. We have Bernardo O'Reilly, who Chris and Vin find through Harry. Harry's told them about this guy, and they find him in an odd locale because he's come on a little bit of hard luck and he's chopping wood. And Bernardo O'Reilly, half Mexican, half Irish, is played by Charles Bronson. Now that's what I say about the joy of watching this film today, because you look back and you see this guy became a superstar. This actor became a superstar. This actor was already big, but it was bigger. It's so cool to see how a movie, when executed well, can take characters who do a really good job and make them famous. And Bronson, after this film, regardless of how famous he became even more famous in the decade of the 70s when he became an international star, or by, I guess, 1968, I would say. And we've seen him before, of course, in Once Upon a Time in the West, when really turned him into an international star in that film. And then in the mid-70s with the film Hard Times, in which he co-starred with James Coburn and was just spectacular. In his 50s, not an ounce of fat on him, playing a street boxer. But in The Magnificent Seven, Charles Bronson is as tough as nails. I do it for the money, gunslinger, and only for the money. Very good at what he does, because the scene is really nice in that Chris and Vin remark to him how he did this and fixed that and how much money he got paid for it. And it's really well written how Chris then tells him how much money they're offering and what the odds are. And of course, Charles Bronson is down and out on his luck at the moment, and the result is obvious. And he plays a very crucial character in this film. Lots of screen time playing Bernardo, interacts with the villagers, is a voice of reason in a very quiet way, as all of Bronson's roles were very quiet in their, for the most part. And again, is a superstar that you just can't take your eyes off of when he's on screen. And so that's Bernardo, and that's Charles Bronson in The Magnificent Seven. That brings us to Vin, our co-star, and if there are two stars, it's Vin and Chris. And Vin was played by Steve McQueen. Now, McQueen was already a star, had become a very recognizable face from his television work, and he played in a Western TV show, and Western television shows were as popular as Western movies. In fact, I think more popular. And he was young. He had that baby face for all of his career, but was a pure superstar. Can't take your eyes off of, nothing but charisma. And he plays Vin, Chris's partner on the hearse, and displaying talents, fearlessness, and his sidekick is maybe his conscience, or questions his motives throughout the film. But Steve McQueen is Steve McQueen, and it's amazing that in 1960, could they have made this film 10 years later with the same cast? Probably not, because they were all too big, too successful, a little bit older, but just too successful to want to get into an ensemble cast of 7 actors. But in 1960, even though he had had television success, somehow he agreed, or they persuaded him, or whatever it took, to be second banana in The Magnificent Seven. And McQueen became if he didn't become a superstar, he was on the verge of becoming a superstar, and that would change in just a couple of years. But McQueen as Vin brings him to life, and really adds that critical element to the film that none of the other characters, none of the other gunslingers brings, because he is sort of the voice of reason, sort of a, what are we doing? Are you sure we should be doing this? And da-da-da-da-da. So it works really, really well. And the last of our Magnificent Seven, but not our last actor, but our last of the Magnificent Seven is Chris, who is the star of the film. And if you're going to make a big picture, and this would have been a big picture, they knew from the get-go that we're making a big picture from another big picture, the Seven Samurai transferred over to the Magnificent Seven, we need a big star. And Yul Brynner was a Hollywood star. Now he's a Hollywood legend, but even in 1960, he was a Hollywood superstar. He had been in musicals, he had been in dramas, he had been in very, very successful films. He probably was as recognizable a face in the movie world, anywhere in the world, as any other actor. And so he plays Chris, the hard-bitten, controlled, always under control, self-disciplined leader of this group. And again, it's almost like every single actor of the 7, you just can't take your eyes off them. They're so compelling on screen. They've got the chops. They're pros. The role is so well written. He has this iconic black shirt, black slacks, black hat, and he is Chris. And in fact, Yul Brynner, who was, as I say, a superstar in 1960, had another claim to fame, because 13 years later, he made a movie in which he played the same character, Chris, but in a completely different film. It was a science fiction film, which is a whole lot of fun, called Westworld. And he plays a gunslinger in that movie. And without talking too much about the film, you'll have to see why his character is reprised in that film. And it's just a whole lot of fun. And it was so much a whole lot of fun that even recently on streaming media, there was a remake of that movie in a very different way called Westworld. It was a series with the same themes, although there was not a Yul Brynner character, but it lived on. So Brynner was a superstar. This film couldn't have made him any bigger than he already was, but he was the big star they needed to make sure that this film would attract audiences, just in case the story didn't work as well as they'd hoped. But of course, the story did work as well as they hoped, and it became a terrifically successful film. As I said, shown thousands and thousands of times on television over the next 20 years. And Yul Brynner was and always will be Chris. That leaves us with the last actor that's worth mentioning, and that's the bad guy. And the bad guy was Calvera, the charismatic leader of these bandits. Nasty fellow, but a very reasonable guy. He can explain away everything he does. Even if he kills somebody, he can explain away why he does it. But he talks about how he has to feed his men, he has to pay his men, so he has to do what he does to these innocent villagers, these farmers who are on the bottom of the food chain and are there to be taken advantage of. And he has to be a good enough bad guy to be a match for Chris and Vin and Bernardo and all these other guys. He has to be a worthwhile opponent. And the actor who played Calvera was Eli Wallach. Eli Wallach was again a pro's pro in Hollywood. He had done many films up to this point. And I don't know how recognizable a face he would have been, because he plays, he's not Spanish, but he plays a Mexican in this film. And he looks the part. I mean, does it take a sombrero and a horse to make you look Mexican? I don't think so. But he looks the part. And in fact, he looked the part so well that he reprised this character in a very different setting, in a very different place, and had nothing to do with a small village in Mexico. He played Tuco, the bad guy, in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, some 8 years later. And he was, of course, a superstar then. By the time that film came out, or that film, I should say, made him a superstar, because he was one of the three. I think he was the bad. Clint Eastwood was the good. Tuco, Eli Wallach was the bad, and Lee Van Cleef was the ugly. But it was essentially the same character, and I think he might have worn the same shirt at times, he said, that he wore in The Magnificent Seven. But Eli Wallach, again, he lived to be 98 years old, and I don't think he stopped working for 1 year for that whole time, from 1960 to I think he passed away just a few years ago when he was 98. His resume is like hundreds and hundreds of television shows and movies. It's incredible how these actors who really knew how to do their thing and had that look and perhaps were just good guys that directors wanted to work with, he just kept working and working for decades. But he plays Calvera, and Calvera lived on in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and I think that was thanks exclusively to Eli Wallach. So that's our cast of magnificent actors, and I think that's the best adjective to describe them in The Magnificent Seven. 7 magnificent actors who are our gunslingers, our good guys, and 1 magnificent actor who is the bad guy. So 8 magnificent actors that populate this film, really make it, when all ensemble films work, the cast elevates the film beyond a terrific story, really well executed, to something special. And of course, I happen to think that The Magnificent Seven is something very, very special. Now, the powers that be, or the power that be, I think, behind this film, and of course I don't know for sure because he wasn't a writer-director, he was just the director, it sounds funny, just the director, was John Sturges. John Sturges is a legend of Hollywood and had been a very well-known director and had worked in the 50s. He began post-war, like many people began after 1945 when the Second World War ended. And he had had a terrific career throughout the 50s, making lots and lots of films until he came upon The Magnificent Seven. And I think that it's his force that made The Magnificent Seven possible. He may not have he did not write the screenplay. He may not have had any input into it. Perhaps he did. But I have to believe that Sturges, who became very famous for making action pictures, really knew how to put together a cast on screen and make them work. And I'd have to say that Sturges was the reason why Magnificent Seven looks the way it looks. It is no, I think, coincidence that 3 of the actors from The Magnificent Seven worked with Sturges. The next big film he did was even bigger than The Magnificent Seven in its time, and I think to this day is also as well regarded as The Magnificent Seven, and that was The Great Escape, which was another massive, massive action picture, a huge cast, perhaps an ensemble cast, well, certainly an ensemble cast even bigger than The Magnificent Seven because there were so many prisoners of war, and they focused on, well, at least a half a dozen of them, probably up to 10 of them they focused on fairly closely. And 3 of the actors from The Magnificent Seven had critical roles in The Great Escape. That was Charles Bronson, who dug tunnels, James Coburn, who had a fun role, a sort of almost comedic role, but a fun role to play in that movie, and Steve McQueen, who was a co-star in The Great Escape. So as I said, if he wasn't a superstar after The Magnificent Seven, he was an international superstar after The Great Escape, because that film just captivated moviegoers worldwide. There were many other big stars in that film: James Garner in The Great Escape, Richard Attenborough, Napoleon Solo's partner, not Robert Vaughn, but Napoleon Solo's partner in The Man from U.N.C.L.E. His name was Ilya Kuryakin in The Man from U.N.C.L.E., but David McCallum was in The Great Escape. But that was a John Sturges film, and I guess it's no surprise that directors liked working with people they could trust, who they knew could do a job. And so I guess it was, again, no coincidence, but clearly an indication of how much Sturges trusted these three actors, Steve McQueen, James Coburn, and Charles Bronson, to appear in a movie that had a bigger budget, that was an even broader scope, and was perhaps as successful, if not more successful, than The Magnificent Seven. That's Sturges, but for us, The Magnificent Seven, I think, is the result of his, I'd like to think, is the result of his efforts, his vision, and when a director can really make an impact on a story this good, I have to believe that Sturges had as much to do with the success of this story as anyone else involved in the film. Yes, I think The Magnificent Seven is as close to a perfect film as Hollywood can make. Now, perfect, what I mean is that if you change the cast, would the movie be any better? If you change the director, if you change the location, for me, I can't think of anything that would improve this film. For what it was trying to do, to be a Western, to be honest to the genre, to be honest to the source material, the Seven Samurai, The Magnificent Seven, I think, exceeds on every single level, such that how could it be any better? And so that's when I use a small p perfect film, where there is no wasted time, no mistakes made that I could see. It just sucks you in right from that, if not from the opening sequence, certainly the second scene when we meet Chris and Vin in the small U.S. town, and we know we're in for a great ride, and we can't wait to watch this film. So The Magnificent Seven, I think, earned its success, earned its fame, earned its role as being replayed on television thousands and thousands of times. It's just a fun film. There's a lot of gunplay, there's a high body count, there's very little blood, there's certainly no gore. Typical, I think, of the films of the late 50s, early 60s. That would change, of course, by The Wild Bunch, when there was a whole lot of all of that. But still, this was 1960, and The Magnificent Seven was what it was. So these magnificent fellows are going to head south, and they're going to defend this village, and they're going to take up arms against Calvera and his 30 or so banditos, and try to do for this village what they asked them to do, which is get rid of the bad guys and allow them to go back to being boring farmers. So it's quite a task. There's only 7 plus the farmers against this horde of bad guys. But we should join the Magnificent Seven along this terrific ride, not from the top of the horse, but from the safety of the 22nd row.